Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. The only podcast with native, React, and radio in its title. Episode 210, Exploring Shopify's Restyle with Haris Mahmood.
All right, so Robin is out this week because she was prepping this week for Microsoft's Web Wednesday, which was yesterday because we are recording on a Thursday. Did you get a chance to tune into that, Jon Major?
I did. It was amazing.
I did too. I really, really liked. So Robin's not the type of person who naturally gravitates to behind a microphone. Usually it takes some amount of effort to kind of push her in that direction.
You would have never guessed.
Yeah, right? Like she is so natural behind it, the microphone. And this time it was live coding, you know, like a live stream in front of a bunch of people, Microsoft stream with Christopher Harrison. And she did such a great job.
Yeah, my heart would have been up in my throat if I was doing that, live coding. But she looked so calm. And it was seriously a fantastic job. I got to learn a lot. I never seen like the rendering of a component from Android to iOS. Yes, I've seen that, shared component style, right, but not to web.
Yeah.
So that was pretty cool to see all three sharing a component.
Yeah, her topic was that she was basically sharing React Native and React Native Web with the same component across a browser, Android, and iOS, with an audience that has never really seen React Native at all. Like this was brand new to them entirely. And I think that was a really cool, she did a great job. It was great to watch her. And we had good support from the team kind of, giving her cheers in there. So that was fun. It was a lot of fun. But she gets the week off of the podcast, of course, because that's plenty. That's plenty on her plate, along with her normal duties of leading I guess one of the bigger projects at Infinite Red right now. That's what she's doing. And both Jon Major and Mazen are on her project. Speaking of which, I am joined by my grand co-hosts here, Jon Major, as well as our guest host, Mazen Chami. And a guest also today, who I will introduce shortly, but really quickly. Jon Major lives in Janesville, Wisconsin, is a senior software engineer here at Infinite Red. He's also the editor-in-chief of the React Native newsletter. And Mazen Chami lives in Durham, North Carolina. He is a former pro soccer player and coach and is a senior React Native engineer, also here at Infinite Red. How's it going, Mazen?
Going well. How are you?
I'm doing well, too. And by the way, I guess I should introduce myself for those who maybe are tuning in for the first time. I am Jamon Holmgren, co-founder and CTO of Infinite Red, and I live in Southwest Washington State, near Portland, Oregon. With us here today is not Haris. Haris is not here today. He actually has, he pulled a muscle in his back or did something. I don't know. The dude is really, really hurting right now. So we were like, okay, take the time to get better. We brought in a guy with one fewer R's in his name, Haris. Did I say that right, Haris? Is that correct?
Absolutely nailed it.
Oh, perfect. I'm glad. Haris Mahmood. Haris is a designer, developer, and educator based in Toronto. He currently works at Shopify. He has taught at various places. It also sells some awesome tech pins on Repit Supply. And I want to, what's a tech pin?
Yeah. So a few years ago, I noticed that there was a pretty big surge and hype around enamel pins all of a sudden. And I realized that there was no one in the market focusing on us fellow developers. So I decided to take a stab, start my own Shopify store, where I ended up manufacturing and selling some JavaScript pins and React pins and all that good stuff.
That's awesome. And were you working at Shopify when you put up your own Shopify store?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that they really recommend that we try and do, to sort of, be merchants ourselves, build that empathy to what it's like to use the tooling and the software itself. Definitely goes a long way.
I always thought that would be kind of cool. Like if you were working on something that you also use and you're just like, man, why don't we have a button here? Like we need a button, like a shortcut from here to there. And you just like are able to maybe talk to the product owner and be like, hey, I want to add this button and then just go in and add it.
Developers, sometimes I feel like we forget to use the product that we build out of development. And I think it's really good that you get the opportunity to build your own store and get to play around with it and see how it works. And like you said, Jamon, like you need an extra button, you can kind of ask the project leads to help you build that. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it definitely helps to notice some things that you feel are missing or could be better, give that feedback to the appropriate teams, and even sometimes play a role in implementing some of those changes. It's a pretty cool cycle, and it just makes the whole experience even better.
I love it. Now you've been involved in another thing called Focus Pocus. Can you talk real quickly about what that's about? It's a great name, by the way.
Thanks very much. So Focus Pocus, unfortunately, has been sunsetted, but this was my first foray into the world of building a little product on the side. It was a form processing tool to help folks who didn't know much about backend code to help them, build out contact forms and whatnot on static websites. And the Focus Pocus tool would take care of all the processing of those forms itself. Yeah,
it makes sense. Forms is always a thing that, like, it's kind of a specialized skill in some ways, but it's such a common thing that needs to be done. Specialized in the sense that, like, really knowing it well is more uncommon. Almost everybody's implemented forms if you're a developer, but
yeah, absolutely. I think it sort of spawned from a need from when I was teaching at these various boot camps and nonprofits, where learning how to build forms in HTML and CSS was part of the course material, and everyone was super excited. But obviously, when you try and actually submit the form, nothing happens. So this sort of came out of like a need to fill that gap while these folks went off and learned a little bit more about backend development and how to maybe support form processing for themselves.
Yeah, awesome. Well, very much appreciate you coming on the show here today, and welcome, Haris. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
This episode is sponsored by Infinite Red. Infinite Red is a premier React Native design and development agency located fully remote in the USA and Canada, with years of React Native experience since it was released and deep roots in the React Native community. We are the hosts of Chain React, the conference. We also publish the React Native newsletter to over 12,000 subscribers. Jon Major does, I should say. I like to say we, because it sounds like I have something to do with it, but it's Jon Major. Let's just be honest here. Infinite Red is the best choice for your next React Native app. Hit us up, hello@infinite.red, or just email me directly, jamon@infinite.red. And of course, if you have any complaints about this episode, you can email Jon Major at infinite.red. That's where complaints go, right, Jon Major?
Yeah, I guess so. Yep. Mm-hmm. No, please don't.
The deer in the headlights look. You know that he would just forward it to me anyway.
Yeah, I have all my emails ready forward to you. So
just directly. Yeah, I email you and it comes back to me, and then I do it, whatever I asked you to do. Yeah. Learn more on our website, infinite.red/React Native. Don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. And also, we are hiring. If you're a senior level React Native engineer located in the US or Canada, go to careers.infinite.red and fill out the form. All right, let's get into the topic for today. Exploring Shopify's Restyle. I'm really excited about this because I've never used Restyle, but when I was looking through it, kind of both when I first heard about it and then also when I was doing a little more in-depth prep for this podcast, it looked a lot like the direction we were trying to go with Ignite's sort of built-in system, but way more mature, way more full-featured, better thought through. Like Ignite's is decent and we use it for a lot of apps, but it's definitely like step 4 and you're at step 10, and I really like this. It's very, very cool. Before we get into Restyle though, tell us a bit, Haris, about how you ended up at Shopify.
So about 5.5 years ago, I was working at an agency, working on a variety of different types of projects, some mobile, some desktop, some web, everything in between. And at that time, I had always had my eyes set on Shopify. I really liked the product that they were building. I loved the e-commerce space. And I knew I eventually wanted to try and weasel my way in. Fortunately, they were hiring and they had just started to build out their front-end development team at that time based in Toronto. And that was the perfect opportunity for me to apply. And long story short, I've been around for almost 6 years at this point.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you're a long timer there. That's awesome. I've used Shopify for at least that long, I think. And just for building for clients, and also did a little bit of stuff for myself with it. And I've always been a big fan. Like I always think that like Shopify is a great product. It's fantastic. So we know a lot of, I mean, most of us, I guess, know what Shopify is, but what's Shop?
That's a good question. So Shopify has predominantly focused on the merchant space, trying to make the merchant experience as excellent as possible. And Shop was Shopify's experiments into the realm of building something that's more buyer focused and trying to solve problems that exist for the buyer space. The app originally started a number of years ago and was called Arrive at that time. And the primary problem it solved was package tracking. Package tracking in general has always been a garbage experience. You've got a whole bunch of tabs open. You're copying and pasting tracking codes all over the place. It's just a disaster. So the focus of Arrive at the time was to build a mobile app that would automatically pull in tracking details from your emails and visualize all of that data for you in maps, give you status updates on where your packages were, send out push notifications when things were out for delivery, that sort of thing. Since then, Arrive has evolved into what is now Shop. We've sort of built more features on top of the core offerings, and we're now focused a lot more on the rediscovery of shops that you've previously purchased from, and also to help you discover new shops in the Shopify ecosystem.
So I'm someone who used Arrive and now is using Shop. And I just realized, honestly, today that Shopify owns Shop. So my question, did Shopify purchase Arrive or was Arrive always Shop?
So Arrive was always part of Shopify. It sort of lived under our experimental/garage group for a little bit, which is where I started off. And since then, as it sort of built its own presence in the space, it's developed a name for itself, but it's always been part of Shopify from the get-go.
Let's talk about Restyle and how that came about. So Restyle is an open source library. It's on GitHub, and it says it's a type-enforced system for building UI components in React Native with TypeScript. I love that type is in there twice. Like, this is clearly a first-class citizen is TypeScript. But let's talk about like what it is and how that came about.
Absolutely. At the start of building Arrive, which is now Shop, there was just a couple of developers. We originally started off with just 2 folks building out some experiments, and there were just 3 React Native developers who were responsible for building the initial version of what is Shop today. At that time, we didn't have too many screens to worry about, too many components to worry about, and we were already starting to feel the limitations of the default styling mechanisms that React Native ships with. Since then, we've scaled immensely. We've got tons of new features and new components and screens, and our team has increased in size tremendously. During that time, we really noticed the pain points that existed with the default styling systems. And we knew that we needed to find a better alternative. The 2 major problems that came about that really forced us to take a step back and analyze what we wanted to do was, one, when we were repeatedly asked for supporting dark mode. That, was all the rage and still is. And we, at that time, didn't support dark mode. And the second was, as we were preparing for the rebrand for Arrive to Shop, we wanted to continue building out new features in Arrive and making it look like Arrive, while making sure that it would fit with the new styling system that we wanted for Shop. So all of a sudden, we now needed to support Arrive and Shop styling, both in light and dark mode. And the default way of handling styles was just impossible. A coworker of mine and I tried to see what that might look like with the Style Sheet API, and our heads were about to explode. It was an awful experience. And we could only imagine how much more complicated it would get to introduce 2 new themes to that entire system. So at this time, a few of our coworkers who were previously part of another company named Ticktail, which became part of Shopify through an acquisition, they had played around with something like Restyle. They had sort of a MVP version of Restyle that they had used internally to help build some of the products that they did in-house. Restyle is essentially a much more polished and crisp version of those tools in the flavor that makes most sense for Shopify and how we build React Native at Shopify. The primary goals of Restyle were to solve a lot of those scaling problems. Like, how can we make sure that anyone at the company doesn't run into too many headaches and aren't stepping on each other's feet while trying to skin the components and screens that they're building, and sort of have this idea of theming capabilities built right from the get-go. So if and when an app decides to support a dark mode theme or an alternate theme entirely, it's almost trivial to do so. And lastly, TypeScript is very, very big at Shopify and like heavily used across all of our web projects and React Native projects. So we really wanted to see if we could tie that in and benefit from the obsession that we had internally with the magic that was TypeScript.
So looking at the documentation of Restyle, it looked very familiar right away. Having used styled system, which is what I believe it's inspired off of, what rough percentage would you say is there of styled system in Restyle?
The concept of having these high-level components that sort of accept a variety of different props for styling is the main concept that is heavily reflected from the style systems concept. We obviously deviated heavily to be able to accommodate the uniqueness that React Native needs to support, and along with some of the naming conventions that we decided to change to make it a little bit more explicit with the prop names and the various component types that we sort of bundle out of the box for React Native.
Nice. So then when it comes to the different predefined components in React Native, there are the concept of variants, which also applies, I believe, in, well, a lot of different styled libraries. So are those variants, though, only possible with the predefined React Native components, or can you create variants in your theme for custom components?
Restyle ships with the ability to create a standardized default view component, which we refer to as a box component, and also a text component. Both of these have support built in right off the bat to support variants. But if you decided to introduce a completely custom component, maybe let's say a card component powered by Restyle, there is a way for you to introduce variant support custom to that specific component that you create as well. So it's not there by default, but Restyle provides all the tools and functions that you would need to make that possible.
Nice. So then would you say that you would put all of the styles inside Restyle in the theme, or would you maybe use create style alongside it?
Restyle does support the default style sheet API as well. You can pass in custom styles using the style prop if needed, but we try and avoid it as much as possible. We really like to enforce the theme concept and the single point of entry for all things style related, whether that's spacing, typography, colors, etc. We do understand that there are certain instances where needing to pass in really, really custom and unique styles for, let's say, when you're fighting with a flat list component, for example. There are circumstances when that's necessary, but if you're just building UI components, we really recommend just sticking with what Restyle provides right out of the box through the theme file and not relying on passing in custom styles using the style prop.
Right on.
I saw in the Restyle repo that you have Polaris tokens. Can you explain a little bit what that is and how that comes full circle back to Restyle?
So I'm not super familiar with the origins of where tokens came from, but from what I do understand is the idea of tokens is to create a unified set of values that can be pulled into various projects that adhere to a specific style system. Polaris is Shopify's style system. It's super well documented. We really like to ensure that anything that we're building adheres to the concept of Polaris, whether that's partner apps, whether that's internal dashboards, whether that's our marketing sites. Shop sort of lives outside that, given that we have our own aesthetic and our own branding. But the rest of Shopify tries to adhere to Polaris as much as possible. Polaris also provides design tokens to accommodate its various sizing values, color values, etc. And Restyle has the ability to pull in those design tokens from Polaris and use those to generate your theme that you would build UIs based off of.
So it's almost like a helper tool to give you specific sizing and or colors, essentially.
Exactly, because by default, the theme file that you create for Restyle is empty. There's no predefined values that Restyle comes with. There's no default themes that Restyle ships with either. The idea is for you to implement your own. And through tokens, you can essentially generate some of that stuff a lot quicker. And you can make sure that the values that you're bringing in are consistent with what the Polaris team has shipped out as their Polaris design tokens.
Awesome. Earlier, you mentioned that, Restyle is built with TypeScript. Can you go into a little bit more what led to your decision to use TypeScript and have that be a first-class citizen in Restyle?
So Shopify has spent the last number of years really building out their understanding of JavaScript, their love of JavaScript. We've got dedicated web foundations teams that focus on all things JS and React and all the tooling to support the work that we do at Shopify for web projects. From the get-go, TypeScript was sort of like integral to what they built out, and it made sense for us to carry some of those learnings over into our React Native projects as well. As I was getting started in React Native, I hadn't actually played around with TypeScript at that point and very quickly saw the value of it, especially as we were scaling the size of our team and, doubling in size almost every month. We very, very quickly went from just the 2 or to 3 folks at the start to 20 plus client developers working on the same code base. So TypeScript in general was super valuable. Plus, the majority of the API work that we do at Shopify is powered by GraphQL. GraphQL is inherently typed as well. And that just made it even clearer to be able to for us to use TypeScript on the client side, just so we could really, leverage the capabilities and the flexibility and the power that GraphQL provides us with providing typed data. On top of that, just the benefit of using TypeScript itself to ensure that it almost acts as like our first line of defense for code quality and reducing bugs and whatnot across the board. And sort of has become the default way we write JavaScript at Shopify, to the point where you could hop onto any React or JS project at Shopify or even React Native at this point and immediately feel at home because the chances of them using TypeScript are super, super high. Similarly for GraphQL, and a number of projects also use Restyle. So just having TypeScript sort of connect all those things together just makes it super cohesive and an awesome work experience.
That's great.
Yeah, Mazen's a big proponent of TypeScript here at Infinite Red, which we've always been. I guess we've used it for about 4 years now, and we love it, of course. But when Mazen came on board this year, he's been pushing us even further, which is great. And I love that because it's not just about it's all the reasons that you said, and it's also scaling and onboarding too is such a big thing because someone comes on board or you're ramping up your team size or whatever, and you can just sort of make sure that these, I guess, implicit contracts for code are explicit and enforced. It's this is the API, and you're gonna use it this way, or else it won't compile, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I was recently onboarding someone with a traditional iOS coding background into React Native, so sort of gave them a crash course on all things JavaScript first before we talked about TypeScript, and they were visibly frustrated at the lack of typing and how you can just throw whatever you want into any arrays or any objects and stuff. And I could clearly see how just JS by itself was causing so much confusion. And I just said, don't worry, when we get to TypeScript, all of these issues go away. So it also really helps when traditional native developers from iOS and Android are coming to a React Native project as well. They can see some of those typing requirements filled by what TypeScript provides rather than needing to just use JS instead.
Something I noticed in the recent years is switching to TypeScript. There's less of the guessing game, which we're all talking about. But when you go from JavaScript to TypeScript, you don't really need much documentation or much tribal knowledge at first because you get so much of the autocomplete feature that you didn't have, with JavaScript and VS Code. And VS Code does a great job, but with TypeScript on top of VS Code, it works wonders.
Absolutely. I think the way I write code has changed dramatically the more we've leaned into all things TypeScript. My reliance on having documentation open has decreased as time has gone by, and I'm leaning more into what TypeScript provides, the autocomplete that VS Code does for us as well. It's really cool to see the shift of how we spend our time as developers as time has moved by in the last few years.
I love thinking of TypeScript as a first line of documentation for your preset design components, because then you don't have to, go out there and check the documentation for that specific component and see what the props are. You essentially hover over it in VS Code and see exactly what are the required fields to get you the minimum component, and then eventually kind of get deeper into what it is. And that's great. My next question is about accessibility. How big of a role does accessibility play in Restyle?
Accessibility itself doesn't play a super big role in Restyle, but it does play a big role in how we build React Native projects at Shopify as a whole. Accessibility is baked into everything that we do. So from the Polaris design system, how you should write content, how you should structure content, accessibility rules start there, built into the fundamentals of how we think about products and how we think about design. At that point, the themes and the designs that we build are based off of color palettes and typography systems, and we make sure that those adhere to the standards and protocols that we need to make sure that what we're building at the end of the day is accessible. Creating these foundations and then relying on these to build our UIs using Restyle, along with the various props that we get from React Native by default, plus some additional finessing that we've had to do ourselves, results in a pretty accessible experience. This is something that we're still working on, something that we're still learning as well. Shopify as a whole is relatively young in the React Native space. So there's lots of education and lots of context building that we're doing on what the best practices are when it comes to accessibility for React Native. But I think we're making pretty good progress. I'm super stoked with the amount of work that we've done on the Shop app so far, and we'll continue to do so in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome. We actually, the project that Rob and Mazen and Jon Major are working on right now, accessibility is not, it feels like sometimes when clients come to us, which I love you clients if you're listening to this, but sometimes accessibility isn't the top priority or even a priority at all. And luckily, the project that they're working on right now, they came to us and they said accessibility is totally a primary concern here. And so it's been something that we've been able to kind of push deeper into and expand our core knowledge around accessibility within React Native, as well as just kind of building a library of knowledge around what types of things we have to be thinking about. And also just kind of exploring and finding where the edges are, because some third-party modules aren't as good at this. Some, maybe ways that we're approaching this aren't as good, and we have to really be thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think certain times folks will just think accessibility means needing to support things like high contrast mode or, just the super default and obvious assumptions that people make when it comes to what accessibility means. Whereas we really like to widen that lens and sort of tackle all aspects of accessibility, obviously from things like color contrast, but also to font scaling, which is baked into every mobile platform. And tons and tons of people will scale their fonts up even a tiny bit just to make it a little bit easier for them to read, because I guess the world has gravitated and moved towards using tinier and tinier fonts. And that's definitely not super helpful to my parents, especially. So even scaling your fonts up a tiny bit, a lot of apps just don't support that and just have these fixed sizing values, or as text scales, it immediately breaks their UIs and render them completely unusable. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to be built up as well, just in this space in general. I think there's lots of folks who don't fully understand the realm of accessibility and how broad it is and the ways that you can make your app more accessible. So I think that's a constant challenge and something that we're working on internally as well, and running little workshops and, building these example cases to help educate the company as a whole.
Yeah, those are some great examples. And I think that I guess tech being generally younger population, just on average, kind of hurts us a little bit in that where we don't really think about it. Now, I'm almost 40, so I'm starting to get to the point where I'm going to start probably thinking about that. But I guess it's just something where, I can see this just fine. Why would someone have a problem with that? Well, yeah, I mean, that's because you're 25 and have 20/20 vision, or, glasses, I guess. But, that's a great point. And having making it so that building accessible apps is really no more difficult than building a normal, I shouldn't say normal, but just an app where that's not a priority. make it like remove the friction, like have tools, have processes in place where you just make it that way. It's just kind of how you do business.
Yeah, I think where we've found the biggest challenge is not necessarily making components accessible or just implementing some of like the basic foundations of how you build an accessible app, but rather the UX behavior of certain elements. How do you expect this interactive map to behave if you have voiceover turned on? Those are some of like the weirder questions that we have to try and figure out answers to that aren't as straightforward, right? So things like, applying a label to images and like accessibility props to buttons. Those things are very trivial and super straightforward. But it's some of those like interesting UX patterns is where things get pretty tricky. And I think that's where where a lot of knowledge is lacking and there's not a lot of like best practices put into place yet. So it's still a little bit of like a wild west when it comes to that. But it's pretty cool to see lots of companies and lots of folks putting in the effort to make their apps accessible and helping define some of these best practices moving forward.
So we've been pushing more this year into what we call React Native All Platforms. We have a hashtag React Native All Platforms. And we're really pushing into, because we basically made the decision that we're going to do React Native wherever it is. We're not going to be doing React.js. We're not going to be doing backend, to any major degree. Really, our focus at Infinite Red is going to be React Native. But that means really going wherever it is. So does Restyle have support for React Native Web, Mac OS, tvOS, Windows? Have you like pushed into any of those other secondary platforms?
So Restyle today doesn't support anything aside from iOS and Android. And that's because Shopify as a whole hasn't really delved into too much React Native besides that. There is, however, one team that recently shipped a rebranded Shopify Ping as Shopify Inbox, which uses React Native Web. And they really loved the experience. They shared a ton of their learnings internally as well. But so far, they've really been the only ones to use React Native Web. I feel that as the need grows internally and as there's a bigger pull towards more React Native web projects, I wouldn't be surprised if Restyle sort of built out some functionality to support that too.
Every time that we talk about React Native Web, I bring this up, but I'm going to do it again. I'm of the opinion that React Native Web is what React.js should have been, because React.js is still too coupled to web. It's like, why did you call that a div? Why did you call that a span? For one thing, those words don't mean anything. Like I don't even know who came up with this naming. Div, span. I like what you did. Box. A box makes sense. I can tell my 8-year-old, hey, draw a box on the screen. She knows what it is. If I tell her draw a div on the screen, she's not going to have any clue. But I look at React Native Web brings in view, it brings in text, it brings in things that are kind of an abstraction layer above whatever platform you're pushing it to by necessity, because of course iOS and Android had different names for things, so they had to abstract it. They didn't just have one platform. So I bring this up every time. React Native Web is what React.js should have been.
I like that. I think right now, if I were to broach that subject to rewrite everything that is in React.js to React Native, a lot of people would not be very happy with me, given how much React.
Be very happy with you.
Yeah, given how much React.js code we have. But I wouldn't be surprised if especially if we spawn off and run some experiments or build some new products off of the shop ecosystem that needs to use a lot of what the React Native apps already provide. React Native Web would be super ideal for that.
Yeah, totally. All right. So I'm going to ask you a hard question, because we're hard-hitting journalists here on the React Native Radio podcast. So what sucks about Restyle?
Ooh. I like to use Restyle in all of my personal projects as well, or like hack days and that sort of a thing. I really do think that Restyle needs to ship with at least one theme, just so you have a starting point. Needing to worry about a color palette and basic typography requirements just seems a little too much if you're just trying to experiment. I would love to see a default starter theme. There's plenty out there that exists. It doesn't have to be super full featured. It would be great to just be able to prototype something a lot quicker. It's just far too much of a lift to build a basic theme right off the bat.
That totally makes sense to me. And I could see that as really a that's a decision that was made to keep it lighter and really more focused. But I like that idea of it shipping with a default theme, or maybe having a place you can go where you can just grab, copy, paste themes really easily and kind of see what they look like. That's a great idea. I love that.
So then in terms of what's next for Restyle, would you say what you just said that sucks about Restyle would be next? Or is there something else?
Oh my goodness. So I feel like now I have to do this. I have to build
Wow,
this.
that was a trapping question, wasn't it?
Well
We
done.
totally trapped you into it.
Well done. I mean, I'm pretty jazzed by that idea. I think I definitely want to. I think that's a cool thing to take on. Aside from that, there aren't any super big features or needs that we've identified that we need to implement for Restyle just yet. There's a number of teams using Restyle at Shopify, and everyone's been pretty stoked about what it's providing out of the box. If things come up, especially things like React Native web support, I think those might be opportunities for us to dive more into building out some more features for Restyle. But for the time being, it's in a pretty good spot. It will need some continuous maintenance just to make sure we're addressing bugs and addressing, just version updates and such. But feature-wise, I think we're in a pretty good space unless we delve into some really, really interesting new directions.
For people who really want to get into Restyle, their interest is peaked here. What's the best way to kind of get started with it?
Great question. So definitely head on over to the GitHub repo. It's github.com/Shopify/Restyle. And there's an awesome set of installation instructions that walk you through all the steps that you need to get going. It may seem like a lot. It may seem like it's pretty daunting, but I promise you it's not. It's just very feature rich. And by default, you don't need to use most of it. You'll mostly be defining a brand new theme, which is just a big JSON object that defines your spacings, your colors, your breakpoints, that sort of a thing, and putting together a provider that is able to handle and accommodate your various themes. And then finally, building out your new box and text components to be able to begin using the values that you've defined in your theme object. So that's all you really need to get started. That's excluding things like, theme toggling and creating your own custom React components. But if I were to npm install and go through all the setup instructions right now, it wouldn't take you more than 5 minutes to go through everything. It's pretty straightforward.
It's fantastic. Yeah, looking at this README, there are a lot of code examples. There are a lot of there's a reference to everything. It looks really good. The README looks good. And I can't wait to dive into this. I'm going to definitely be playing around with it myself on some stuff. So yeah, very, very cool.
Jamie's going to have a PR for you for the what quote unquote sucks.
Yes, please.
I may. Or I'll email you, Jon Major, and then it'll come back to me, and then I'll have to do it.
Or maybe even a Jamon themed starting theme for Restyle.
I love it. I don't know if people want to rely on my design experience, but you know what? I could give it a try. We did have a question for you from the community. David Loulette, a good friend of mine, says, I use Restyle with all my clients and it increases productivity for sure. No more inception design development with 5 levels of abstraction. Question, how would you handle the new pressable API with Restyle, especially for a pressed style?
The pressable API, if I remember this correctly, the style prop for pressable accepts a pressed prop that helps identify the state of the pressable component.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my immediate assumption is to create our own abstraction around pressable that takes in those Restyle props and maps them down to those various 2 states for the pressed and non-pressed state for the pressable components. I think that should cover your bases, and that'll just, you're all set.
Yeah, that sounds great. I forgot. I haven't used pressable a lot, but I do remember that it passes through the state to your styles, and then it kind of can pick that up. Awesome. And lastly, I assume some of our listeners their interest may be piqued a little bit here. Is Shopify hiring right now, Haris?
Ooh, indeed we are. Shopify's got this goal of hiring 2,021 engineers in the year 2021, which is pretty exciting. So we're growing super super fast. Shopify is also now fully remote, moving forward, even post-pandemic times. So you're welcome to apply from anywhere in the world. Currently, the two major teams that are looking for folks are the shop team itself and also our retail team. And we're looking for all sorts of senior engineers, whether that's back-end, front-end, React Native, or traditional iOS and Android devs. Feel free to reach out to me, or I'll make sure to share a couple of links on my Twitter after this as well. So feel free to take a look at those, or you can just hit up shopify.com/careers.
That's perfect. Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things about Shopify. Obviously, you've been there for years now, Haris, so they must be doing something right. And yeah, 2,021 engineers in 1 year. That is a lot of growth. That is incredible. We're hiring a few. We're not hiring 2,021. So you can have the best of you can apply at Infinite Red, and the rest go to Shopify. I'm just joking. Okay, we're a little over time, so I'm not going to go into the weird bug or what's new with the React Native newsletter. Go to reactnativenewsletter.com to check out the latest edition. Jon Major actually just pushed one out before our recording, so go check that out. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. I was actually clicking through and opening like 8 different tabs based on all the cool stuff that he's linked to. Where can people find you on Twitter, Haris?
I'm a huge fan of dinosaurs. There's a reason why I just mentioned that. It's pretty much because all of my social handles across pretty much all platforms is just Harisaurus. So find me on GitHub, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. I'd love to chat more about all things Shopify and React Native.
Perfect. And Jon Major, where can people find you?
At Jon Major C.
Mazen?
You can find me at Mazen Chami on Twitter.
And I'm at Jamon Holmgren. You can also find the podcast Twitter. Go follow it right now. We'll give you some time. Go follow it right now. React Native RDIO. All right. You got it up on Twitter yet? Go ahead and click that follow button.
Oh, wait. While you're at it, go to React Native or RN. Dang,
we can never remember this.
Oh my gosh.
It's RN Newsletter.
RN
Click
Newsletter.
on RN Newsletter. Yeah. Go hit follow there. There's some good content there coming out as well. As always, thanks to our producer and editor, Todd Worth, our transcript and release coordinator, Jed Bartosky, our social media coordinator, Missy Warren, and our designer, Justin Husky. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out, infinite.red/React Native. Huge thanks to Haris for joining us today. Really appreciate you coming on and talking about Restyle. Can't wait to check that out. And of course, thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe, and we will see you all next time.